Sarah adjusted her grip on the steering wheel as the familiar hum of the bus engine filled the otherwise silent night. Her route took her through the sleepy streets of Rivertown, a place where nothing ever seemed to change. Fog wrapped around the bus like a thick blanket, distorting the glow of the streetlights and making the empty streets look even more desolate. She absent-mindedly rubbed her swollen belly, feeling the subtle movement of her unborn child. It was getting harder to drive these long shifts, but Sarah needed the money. Soon, she'd go on maternity leave, and the extra income was essential to cover the expenses of a growing family. Her husband, Tom, had suggested she cut back, but she was stubborn, unwilling to stop until absolutely necessary. The isolation of the night shift gave Sarah time to think, though lately, her thoughts had been circling around one thing: motherhood. Was she ready for this? Could she protect her child from the uncertainties of the world? The town might have seemed peaceful on the surface, but underneath, Sarah knew that danger could lurk anywhere. As the bus turned onto a rural road, its headlights barely cutting through the dense fog, something caught her eye in the distance. A figure, barely visible, stood at the side of the road. Sarah slowed down, squinting through the haze. A woman, soaked from the rain, was standing alone, her clothes clinging to her body as she waved hesitantly. Sarah hesitated. It was late, and she wasn't supposed to pick up passengers here. But something about the woman's desperate expression stirred a sense of responsibility in her. She pulled the bus to a stop and opened the door. The woman stepped on board, her eyes wide with fear. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what else to do." Sarah nodded, motioning her to take a seat. The bus was empty except for the two of them. As the woman sat down, Sarah noticed how thin and frail she looked, like someone who had been running from something for a long time. The fog thickened as Sarah pressed the accelerator, guiding the bus back onto the road. The silence inside the bus was heavy, filled only by the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. Sarah glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the stranger as she sat in the farthest seat. She seemed to shrink into herself, her hands trembling in her lap. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, trying to break the tension. "Lena," the woman replied, barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, keeping her eyes on the road. "Are you all right? You seem scared." Lena hesitated, her eyes darting toward the fogged-up window. "I can't go to the police. Please, you can't take me there." Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Why not?" "I just can't." Lena's voice cracked. "It's too dangerous." Before Sarah could respond, a flicker of light in her rearview mirror caught her attention. She glanced back and saw the headlights of a car approaching from behind. At first, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary, but then the car sped up, closing the distance between them. Something was off. Sarah's pulse quickened as the car followed closely, almost too closely. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence. "Do you know them?" she asked, her voice tight. Lena's face drained of color. "They found me," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "Who are they?" Lena didn't answer, but the fear in her expression spoke volumes. Sarah's mind raced as the car behind them swerved, attempting to overtake the bus on the narrow, foggy road. Panic set in, and Sarah did the only thing she could think of. She sped up, trying to lose the car in the winding turns. The rain intensified, hammering against the windshield as the bus roared down the desolate road. The headlights of the car behind them grew brighter, almost blinding. Sarah's hands shook, but she kept her focus on the road ahead, adrenaline pushing her through the fear. "Hold on," she muttered to herself as the bus veered sharply around a corner. The car behind them followed, persistent, unrelenting. It wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever was driving that car was after Lena. And now they were after Sarah too. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears as the bus swerved along the winding road. Her knuckles turned white against the steering wheel, her eyes darting between the fog-obscured path ahead and the ominous glow of headlights growing closer in the rearview mirror. Every muscle in her body tensed, and she felt a sharp twinge in her lower back, a reminder that she wasn't just running for herself. Lena sat frozen in the back seat, her body rigid with fear. "They won't stop until they get me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. The weight of Lena's words hit Sarah like a cold slap. She had no idea who these people were or why they were after Lena, but it was clear that this was no ordinary chase. Her instincts screamed at her to stop, to pull over, and let Lena deal with her own problems. But she couldn't. Something in Lena's terror stirred a deep empathy within Sarah, the same fierce protectiveness she imagined she would feel for her own child. The car behind them swerved again, trying to force the bus off the road. Sarah's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. She had to think fast. She knew these roads better than any outsider. If she could just make it to the old highway, the one that cut through the dense woods and circled the lake, she might be able to lose them. But there was no guarantee she would make it. "Why are they after you?" Sarah asked, her voice tense, eyes locked on the twisting road ahead. She needed answers, something to help her understand the gravity of the situation. Lena hesitated, her eyes downcast. "I can't tell you everything. It's not safe for you to know. Not safe for me." Sarah shot back, her voice rising with frustration. "I'm already involved, Lena. If they're chasing you, they're chasing me too. They're dangerous," Lena whispered. She broke off, her breath catching in her throat as the car behind them accelerated again, closing the gap. "Please, just trust me." Sarah swallowed hard. The bus skidded slightly as she took another sharp turn. The headlights disappeared for a moment, but she knew the car was still there, lurking just behind them. The fog was thicker now, wrapping around the bus like a shroud. Her vision blurred with the mist, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. She pushed the bus harder, the engine groaning under the strain. The road ahead twisted sharply again, and Sarah jerked the wheel, barely avoiding the edge of the embankment. She didn't have time to think, only react, as the chase continued. "We're not going to make it at this rate," Sarah muttered under her breath. But just as her panic threatened to overtake her, she spotted the faint outline of a sign up ahead. Old Timber Road. Relief washed over her. If she could just make that turn, they might have a chance. With a deep breath, Sarah yanked the wheel to the right, sending the bus careening down the narrow, nearly forgotten road. The bus bounced over potholes, the rain-soaked dirt road doing little to cushion the ride. Behind them, the car's headlights flickered in the distance, still following but struggling to keep up. Sarah kept her focus sharp, her heart pounding in her chest as they raced down the isolated path. The trees closed in around them, thick and looming in the fog, giving the impression that they were entering a different world altogether, a world where the rules were different, where she and Lena might stand a chance. The bus rattled down Old Timber Road, its heavy wheels splashing through deep puddles as Sarah guided it through the thickening forest. The road was rough and narrow, but for the first time, the car behind them seemed to lose some of its momentum. The thick trees and winding path made it difficult for their pursuers to keep up. Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe, though her nerves were still on edge. She glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing that Lena was hunched over, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trembling. "What's really going on?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now, but still tinged with urgency. "If you want me to help you, I need to know." Lena hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting toward the window as if she were searching for some escape. Then, finally, she spoke. "They work for someone powerful," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I worked for them. I was just supposed to be part of a system, nothing more. But then I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. And now they want to make sure I stay quiet." Sarah's stomach nodded. "Who are they?" Lena shook her head. "I don't even know all their names, but they have connections everywhere. In the police, in the government. They control everything." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. Rivertown had always seemed like such a peaceful, quiet place. The idea that something so sinister could be hiding beneath the surface felt surreal. But looking into Lena's eyes, she could see the truth in her fear. "They're not going to stop until they find me," Lena continued, her voice quivering. "And now you're involved too. I'm so sorry." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the information. She couldn't believe that she was now entangled in something so dangerous. And yet, here she was. She couldn't turn back now. "We'll figure out," Sarah said, more to herself than Lena. "We just need to get somewhere safe." But even as she said it, Sarah knew that safety was a long way off. They had only bought themselves a little time. Eventually, those men would catch up. Lena's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me. Maybe I should just leave. You've done enough." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "We're in this together now." The road twisted and turned as they continued deeper into the forest, but Sarah's resolve had only hardened. She didn't know how they would get out of this, but she couldn't abandon Lena now. Whatever secrets Lena held, they were tied to something bigger than both of them. The bus jolted as it hit another pothole, and Sarah's hands tightened around the wheel. She was determined to find a way out, even if it meant confronting the darkness hiding in Rivertown. The forest thickened as the road narrowed, the bus groaning under the strain of the uneven terrain. Sarah's grip on the wheel had tightened, her knuckles pale against the dark leather. She was trying to keep her breathing steady, but the tension wrapped around her like a vice. In the rear-view mirror, Lena sat quietly, her face a mask of guilt and fear. It was as though both women understood the magnitude of what they were up against without needing to speak. Sarah knew they couldn't keep driving forever. The gas was running low, and the bus wouldn't last much longer on these back roads. Her mind raced through the possibilities, but none seemed promising. Where could they go where those men wouldn't find them? And how could they keep ahead when the people chasing them seemed to know every turn they made? Lena shifted in her seat, her eyes darting to the rear window as though expecting to see headlights at any moment. "We can't stop here," she whispered. "I know," Sarah replied, her voice tense. She had been running through her options, but there weren't many. Going back to town was too dangerous, and the only other route took them even deeper into the woods, toward the lake. Isolated, yes, but would it be safe? The thought of stopping weighed heavily on Sarah. If they pulled over and took refuge somewhere, they'd be sitting ducks. But they couldn't outrun them forever either. She felt the baby kick gently inside her, and a wave of fear surged through her chest. It wasn't just her life on a line. Suddenly, a soft buzzing sound broke the silence. Sarah glanced toward the dashboard, realizing her phone had lit up with a call. Her heart leapt when she saw Tom's name on the screen. "Hold on," she muttered, pulling the bus to a brief halt on the side of the road. She didn't want to stop, but she needed to know if Tom had heard anything, if he could help. She picked up the phone quickly, her voice strained. "Tom." "Sarah, what's going on?" "I've been trying to reach you. The police." "Tom, listen to me," Sarah interrupted, her voice shaking. "I can't explain everything right now, but I'm in trouble. I'm with someone, and there are people after her. Dangerous people." Tom's voice sharpened with concern. "Sarah, what do you mean? Where are you? I can come get you." "No, you can't. I don't want to drag you into this," Sarah said, her heart pounding in her chest. "These people, they're connected. I don't know who to trust." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear Tom breathing, the tension between them palpable. "Please just tell me where you are. We'll figure it out together," he finally said, his voice calmer but no less worried. "I can't," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't risk it." Before Tom could respond, Sarah heard a noise that sent her pulse skyrocketing. A car engine rumbling in the distance. Her eyes snapped to the rear-view mirror, but there was nothing yet. The sound was faint, growing slowly louder. "They're coming," Lena said softly, her voice tinged with terror. Sarah's heart sank. She had no choice but to end the call. "I have to go, Tom. Please. Just trust me." Without waiting for his reply, she hung up, throwing the phone onto the passenger seat. Panic threatened to swallow her whole, but she pushed it down, forcing herself to focus. She started the bus again, turning down the narrow road that led deeper into the woods, hoping against hope that it might buy them more time. The forest felt like it was closing in around them, the trees casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the road. Sarah's mind raced as she navigated the narrow path, but no matter how far they went, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of options. The sound of the engine behind them had faded, but that didn't mean they were safe. Lena sat in the back of the bus, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes wide and filled with fear. She hadn't said much since Sarah had spoken to Tom, but the weight of her guilt was palpable. "I never should have involved you," Lena finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Sarah's chest tightened at the words, but she shook her head. "It's not your fault. I chose to help you." Lena wiped at her eyes, trying to steady her trembling hands. "But you didn't know what you were getting into." "Neither did you," Sarah said, glancing at Lena in the rearview mirror. "But we're in this now, and we have to figure it out." Lena looked down at her hands, silent for a moment before she finally spoke again. "I thought I could outrun them. I thought if I left everything behind, they wouldn't care enough to keep looking. But I was wrong. They have eyes everywhere." Sarah's pulse quickened. "You said they're connected. How connected?" Lena let out a shaky breath. "They're not just small-time criminals. They're part of a larger network, a corruption ring. They've infiltrated law enforcement, the government, even people in this town." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "What do they want from you?" Lena hesitated. "I found something. Evidence. I didn't mean to, but once I saw it, they couldn't let me walk away. They've been chasing me ever since." Sarah's mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just a random chase. Lena was holding something valuable, something dangerous, and the people after her would stop at nothing to get it back. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. Lena glanced nervously out the window. "I can't tell you everything. It's too dangerous for you to know." Sarah let out a frustrated sigh. "Lena, I'm already involved. If they're coming after me too, I deserve to know what I'm up against." Lena closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping. "It's documents, names, bank accounts, transactions that tie these people to illegal activities. If the right people see them, the whole network could come crashing down." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "So that's why they're chasing you." Lena nodded. "And now they're chasing you too." Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing. She had no idea how to protect them both, but one thing was clear. There was no going back now. The only way out was to see this through to the end. "We need to find somewhere to hide," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Somewhere they won't think to look." Lena hesitated before speaking. "There's an old cabin by the lake, just past the woods. It's been abandoned for years. No one goes there." Sarah didn't like the idea of hiding in an isolated cabin, but they were running out of options. With a deep breath, she nodded and turned the bus toward the lake, hoping that it might offer the refuge they so desperately needed. The narrow road leading to the lake twisted and turned through the dense forest, the trees forming an impenetrable wall of darkness on either side of the bus. Sarah's hands were steady on the wheel, but her heart raced with each passing minute. Lena's words about the cabin echoed in her mind. It was their only chance, an abandoned refuge where no one would think to look. But even as they drew closer, a sense of dread settled over Sarah. The bus creaked and groaned as it navigated the rough terrain, the headlights cutting through the gloom. Lena sat in the back, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the window as though expecting danger to materialize out of the shadows. Sarah could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her, each breath heavier than the last. "We're almost there," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the bus engine. "It's just up ahead." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the road. She wasn't sure what she expected, but the sight of the small, dilapidated cabin at the end of the road filled her with unease. It sat nestled between the trees, its roof sagging and windows dark, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. Weeds and overgrown bushes crowded the path leading to the front door, and the air around it felt still, almost too still. "This is it," Sarah asked, her voice thick with doubt. Lena nodded again, her eyes flicking nervously toward the rear window. It's safe. No one knows about it. Safe. The word fell hollow to Sarah now, but there was no turning back. She pulled the bus to a stop a few yards away from the cabin and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, and for a moment, neither of them moved. We should hurry, Lena said, breaking the silence. We don't know how long we have before they catch up. Sarah nodded, her body moving on autopilot as she grabbed her bag and opened the door. The cold night air hit her face as she stepped out, the rustle of leaves beneath her feet the only sound. She glanced around, her eyes darting between the trees, but there was no sign of anyone following them. Yet, Lena followed close behind, clutching her jacket tightly around her thin frame as they hurried toward the cabin. The old wooden door creaked as Sarah pushed it open, revealing a small, musty interior. The air was thick with dust, and the furniture was worn and faded, as though the cabin hadn't been touched in years. A single window at the back let in a sliver of moonlight, casting long shadows across the floor. It's not much, but it'll do, Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah closed the door behind them, the sound of the latch clicking into place, sending a chill down her spine. Do you think they'll find us? Lena hesitated before answering. I don't know, but it's better than staying out in the open. Sarah's mind raced. She didn't trust this cabin, didn't trust the feeling of isolation that came with it, but she had no other options. They needed to hide, at least for the night, and this was the best they could hope for. Let's stay low, Sarah muttered, moving to one of the dusty chairs and lowering herself onto it. She winced as a sharp pain shot through her back, a reminder that the stress of the chase was taking a toll on her body. She instinctively placed a hand on her belly, feeling the subtle movements of her baby. A wave of protectiveness surged through her. She had to survive this. For her child. Lena paced the small room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I never thought it would come to this. I thought I could outrun them, but they're everywhere. Sarah looked up at her, eyes narrowing. You mentioned they have people in the police. How far does this go? Lena stopped pacing, her face pale. Far, farther than I realized. The people chasing us, they're not just criminals. They're part of something much bigger, something that has its hands in everything. If they get to me, they'll make sure I disappear. Sarah's heart sank. It was worse than she thought. If Lena was right, they weren't just running from a few dangerous men. They were running from a network that had the power to erase them completely. Suddenly, there was a faint noise outside, a low rumble that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She tensed, her eyes flicking to the window, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness. The sound grew louder, more distinct. An engine, a car. They've found us, Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the sound of the approaching car grew louder, the rumble of its engine cutting through the silence like a blade. Her heart raced, adrenaline surging through her veins as she shot up from the chair, her eyes locked on the door. She could feel Lena's panic, the air in the cabin thick with tension. We need to hide, Lena hissed, her voice urgent. But before they could move, the sound of the car engine stopped abruptly. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen, listening for any sign of movement outside. Footsteps, a door opening, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. Whoever was out there, they were getting closer. Sarah's mind raced, running through the possibilities. Was it the men chasing them? Had they finally caught up? Or was it someone else? Someone who might help them? The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Lena backed up toward the far corner, her body trembling as she pressed herself against the wall. Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to move toward the window. She peered through the crack in the curtains, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was outside. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping cautiously toward the cabin. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the dim light. But there was something familiar about him, something that tugged at Sarah's memory. Her breath hitched in her throat as the man stepped closer. He wasn't one of the men from the car that had been following them earlier. He was someone else entirely. He knocked on the door, the sound loud and deliberate in the quiet of the night. "Sarah, are you in there?" Sarah's heart leapt in her chest. The voice, it was him, the stranger from a gas station. Lena's eyes widened in fear. "It's him. We can't trust him." Sarah hesitated, torn between Lena's warning and the man's familiarity. He had helped them before, or at least pretended to. But could she trust him now, when everything was at stake? The man knocked again, his voice calm but firm. "I know you're scared, but I can help you." Lena shook her head, her eyes pleading with Sarah. "He's working for them. Don't let him in." Sarah's mind raced. If this man was working for their pursuers, then letting him in could be the worst decision she'd ever make. But if he wasn't, if he was truly here to help, then turning him away could mean losing their last chance at survival. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made her decision. She slowly approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. "What do you want?" she called through the door, her voice wavering. "I want to keep you safe," the man replied. "I know you don't trust me, but you're in more danger than you realize. Let me help." Sarah glanced back at Lena, whose face was a mask of terror. "Don't," she mouthed, shaking her head furiously. But Sarah's gut told her something different. This man might be their only shot. She took a deep breath and unlocked the door. The man stepped inside, his face illuminated by the dim light of the cabin. He was calm, composed, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Sarah. "We don't have much time. They'll be here soon." Lena shrunk further into the corner, her fear palpable. "He's one of them," she whispered, her voice shaking. The man looked at Sarah, his expression serious. "I'm not here to hurt you, but if you don't trust me, this will end badly for both of you." Sarah's heart raced. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no choice. Time was running out, and the enemy was closing in. The air in the cabin felt thick, almost suffocating, as Sarah stood face to face with the man she had just let in. His calm demeanor was unsettling, and though his words seemed to offer safety, a deep unease gnawed at her. Lena's quiet sobs from the corner of the room only heightened the tension. Sarah moved slightly, putting herself between the man and Lena. She wasn't sure if she was protecting Lena from him or trying to create space to think clearly. The man, noticing her hesitation, raised his hands in a show of surrender. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice steady. "But the people who are coming for you, they'll be here any moment. We need to move." Sarah's heart pounded as she weighed her options. Every instinct screamed at her not to trust him, but her options were running out fast. She glanced back at Lena, who sat frozen in fear, shaking her head in silent protest. "How do I know you're not one of them?" Sarah asked, her voice low but firm. The man looked at her with an unreadable expression. "If I were one of them, you'd already be in their hands. I had the chance to turn you in at the gas station. I didn't." Sarah didn't reply, but her mind raced through the possibilities. Could he really be telling the truth? Or was this just another layer to the trap? The silence between them was broken by the distant rumble of engines. Sarah's stomach dropped. The men chasing them were close. Too close. She could feel the vibrations through the floorboards of the cabin, the unmistakable sound of danger approaching fast. "We don't have time for this," the man said, urgency creeping into his voice. "Either you trust me, or you get caught. Your choice." Lena stood abruptly, panic in her eyes. "Sarah, we can't trust him," she cried, her voice breaking. "He's one of them. He's here to lead them right to us." The man turned to Lena, his expression hardening. "I'm here to help you, but if you can't trust me, then you're sealing your own fate." Sarah's head spun, torn between Lena's terror and the man's apparent logic. She had to make a choice, and quickly. The sound of engines grew louder, and she knew they had only moments left before the men chasing them would arrive. She took a deep breath, her mind settling on a decision. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "But if you do anything to betray us..." The man nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. I won't. But we have to go now. Without another word, Sarah grabbed Lena by the arm, pulling her toward the door. The man led the way, his movements quick and precise. He seemed to know the terrain well, navigating through the trees as though he had done this before. Sarah's doubts still lingered, but there was no turning back now. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound of the pursuing cars grew fainter, though Sarah knew they wouldn't be far behind. The man led them to a small path, barely visible in the moonlight, that wound through the trees toward an old shed nestled by the edge of the lake. "This way," he said, motioning for them to follow. They slipped into the shed, its walls creaking with age. The man closed the door behind them and pulled a heavy, rusted bolt across it. Sarah's breath was heavy as she leaned against the wall, her heart still racing. Lena stood near the corner, her face pale and tear-streaked. "This isn't right. We shouldn't have trusted him." Before Sarah could respond, the man turned to them, his eyes sharp. "We don't have much time. There's a boat on the lake that can get you out of here, but we need to move quickly." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "How do you know so much?" The man hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Because I've been watching them for a long time. I'm not one of them, but I know how they operate. If you stay here, you'll be caught. But if you come with me, there's a chance you'll make it out." Sarah looked at Lena, who was still trembling with fear. She could see the distrust etched on her face, but Sarah knew they didn't have any better options. They had to keep moving. "All right," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We'll take the boat." But as she said the words, the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong only grew stronger. The shed felt like a fragile bubble of safety, but Sarah knew it wouldn't last. Outside, the faint sounds of engines had faded, but the tension in the air remained thick. The man motioned for them to follow, and with every step, Sarah felt her resolve harden. She couldn't afford to hesitate now, not with her baby's life on the line. The man led them out of the shed and toward a narrow trail that wound its way down to the lake. The moonlight shimmered off the water, casting a silvery glow on the surface, but the beauty of the scene was lost in the urgency of their situation. Sarah could feel Lena's tension radiating beside her as they hurried along the path. The man kept a steady pace, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. As they reached the shore, the outline of a small boat came into view, its weathered hull barely visible in the dim light. The man stepped forward, untying the rope that secured it to a post. "Get in," he said, his voice low but insistent. Lena hesitated, her eyes darting between Sarah and the boat. "We can't trust him," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "This feels wrong." Sarah glanced at the man, who was busy with the boat, and then back at Lena. She understood Lena's fear. She felt it too, but there was no turning back now. They were too far in, and the enemy was closing in. "Get in," Sarah said softly, urging Lena forward. Reluctantly, Lena climbed into the boat, her movements stiff with fear. Sarah followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The man stepped into the boat after them, grabbing the oars and pushing off from the shore. The boat glided silently across the water, the soft splash of the oars the only sound breaking the stillness. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the shoreline, waiting for any sign of their pursuers. But the woods remained silent, the darkness thick and impenetrable. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to breathe, to believe that they might actually escape. But then, from the far side of the lake, she saw them. A set of headlights cut through the darkness, the faint sound of engines reaching her ears. The men had found them. "They're coming," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. The man rowed faster, his arms straining against the oars. "We'll make it. Just hold on." But Sarah wasn't sure they would. The headlights grew closer, brighter, and soon she could see the outline of the cars as they sped along the shoreline, tracking their movements across the lake. "We're not going to make it," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't let this end here, not when they were so close to freedom. Her eyes darted around the boat, searching for something, anything that might help them. Then, her gaze landed on the man. His calm demeanor, his knowledge of the enemy, the way he had led them here. It all fell into place in an instant. "You betrayed us," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with rage. The man didn't respond, but his silence confirmed everything. Without thinking, Sarah lunged at him, her hands grabbing for the oar in his hand. The boat rocked violently as they struggled, the water splashing up around them. Lena screamed, her voice piercing the night as she tried to steady the boat. "You led them right to us," Sarah shouted, her anger boiling over. The man's grip on the oar tightened, but Sarah fought harder, her desperation giving her strength. With one final shove, she knocked the oar from his hands, sending it crashing into the water. The boat tipped precariously, and for a moment, it seemed like they might capsize. But as the boat rocked back into place, the man stumbled, losing his balance and falling backward into the lake with a splash. Sarah watched in disbelief as he disappeared beneath the surface, his betrayal sinking with him. The sound of the man's body hitting the water echoed across the lake, followed by an eerie silence. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she gripped the edges of the boat, her hands trembling with the adrenaline coursing through her. The cold night air stung her face, but it was nothing compared to the fear that gripped her heart. She stared at the dark water where the man had disappeared, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Lena, wide-eyed and still trembling, clutched the side of the boat, her voice shaking. "Sarah, what do we do now?" The headlights from the cars on the far side of the lake had stopped moving, their beams cutting through the night like searching eyes. Sarah knew they didn't have much time before the men chasing them would figure out what had happened. The man who had betrayed them was gone, but the threat was far from over. "We keep going," Sarah said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We have to get to the other side before they catch up." Lena nodded, her movements stiff with fear, but she reached for one of the remaining oars. Sarah grabbed the other, and together they began to row, their arms straining as they pushed the small boat across the lake. Every stroke of the oars felt like a battle, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The minutes dragged on, each one filled with the sound of their labored breathing and the rhythmic splash of the oars in the water. Sarah's mind raced, thoughts of her baby swirling through her exhaustion. She had to survive this. For her child. The idea of failing now, so close to freedom, was unbearable. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will," Sarah said, her eyes focused on the distant shore. "But we'll be long gone by the time they get here." She wasn't sure if she believed her own words, but it was all she had. The shore was getting closer, the dark silhouette of the trees growing larger with each passing second. They were almost there. Suddenly, the sound of an engine roared to life, shattering the quiet. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as she glanced back. One of the cars on the other side of the lake had started moving again, its headlights sweeping across the water as it raced along the shoreline. "They've found us," Lena cried, her voice rising in panic. Sarah gritted her teeth, her arms burning as she rowed harder. "Keep going. We're almost there." The boat surged forward, the shore drawing closer with each stroke. But the car was fast, too fast. Sarah could hear it now, the roar of the engine growing louder as it sped toward their destination. "We're not going to make it," Lena sobbed, her hands shaking on the oar. "Yes, we are," Sarah snapped, her voice fierce. "Just keep rowing." The boat hit the shallow water near the shore with a soft thud, and Sarah jumped out, her legs wobbling as she splashed into the icy water. She grabbed Lena's arm, pulling her out of the boat and dragging her toward the trees. "Come on," Sarah urged, her voice barely holding back the panic threatening to take over. They stumbled through the underbrush, the sound of the car growing louder behind them. Sarah's mind raced. There had to be somewhere they could hide, some way to escape. But the woods were dense, the terrain unfamiliar, and the men chasing them were relentless. Just as they reached the tree line, the beam of the car's headlights swung toward them, illuminating their path. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled Lena down behind a cluster of bushes, praying they wouldn't be seen. The car screeched to a stop not far from where they had left the boat, the engine idling as the doors opened. Sarah held her breath, her hand tightening around Lena's arm as they crouched low, hidden by the thick foliage. "We have to stay quiet," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Lena nodded, tears streaming down her face as she clung to Sarah. The sound of footsteps crunched on the gravel as the men moved closer, their voices low but tense. Sarah couldn't make out what they were saying, but the urgency in their tone sent a wave of fear through her. They were close, too close. Sarah's heart raced as she heard the footsteps approaching, the men's voices growing louder. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, praying they wouldn't be discovered. But as the footsteps neared, a sudden flash of light illuminated their hiding spot. There they are. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They had been found. The beam of the flashlight swept over Sarah and Lena, and the men shouted in triumph, closing in on them with terrifying speed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she scrambled to her feet, pulling Lena with her. They had no time to think, only to run. The woods were thick, the underbrush tearing at their legs as they pushed through, branches whipping at their faces. The sound of the men's pursuit was deafening, their footsteps pounding the ground behind them, closing in with every second. "We can't outrun them," Lena cried, her voice breaking. "We have to try," Sarah replied, her voice strained with effort. She could feel her body weakening, exhaustion clawing at her, but she pushed forward, her baby's safety the only thing driving her. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Sarah's abdomen, stopping her in her tracks. She doubled over, clutching her belly, a wave of panic washing over her. "No, not now, not here." Lena skidded to a stop, turning back to Sarah, her face pale with fear. "What's wrong?" Sarah's breath came in short, painful gasps as the pain intensified. "The baby. I think something's wrong." Lena's eyes widened in terror. "We have to get you to a hospital." But before they could move, the men caught up, surrounding them. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at Lena, fear flashing between them. This was it. They were out of time, out of options. One of the men stepped forward, his face cold and hard. "You've caused us a lot of trouble," he said, his voice laced with menace. "But it ends here." Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't let it end like this. Not after everything they'd been through. Not with her baby's life on the line. She had to find a way out. Just as the man raised his gun, a voice called out from the darkness. "Stop." Everyone froze, turning toward the source of the voice. A figure stepped out of the shadows, their face obscured by the darkness. Sarah squinted, trying to make out who it was. But before she could, the figure spoke again. "Leave them alone." The men hesitated, their eyes flicking between the newcomer and Sarah. The tension was thick, the air crackling with uncertainty. Then, to Sarah's shock, the men began to back away, their expressions hardening with frustration. "We'll be back," the leader spat before turning and motioning for his men to follow. Within moments, they had disappeared into the woods, their footsteps fading into the distance. Sarah's heart pounded as she stared after them, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She turned toward the figure who had saved them, her breath catching in her throat. It was Tom. Her husband stepped forward, his face tight with worry. "Sarah, are you okay?" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she stumbled toward him, relief flooding her body. How did you find us?" "I had a feeling," Tom said, pulling her into his arms. "I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to help." Sarah clung to him, her body shaking with the aftermath of fear and relief. She couldn't believe it. He had come for her. He had saved them. Lena stood nearby, watching the reunion with wide eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Tom nodded, his arm around Sarah as he turned toward Lena. "We need to get you both to safety." With Tom's help, They made their way back through the woods, the fear of the men lingering, but no longer a threat. Sarah's mind swirled with everything that had happened, but one thought remained clear. They were free. The drive to safety felt like a blur, but as the adrenaline faded, Sarah felt a new kind of peace settle over her. She had survived. Her baby had survived. They had escaped the nightmare that had nearly consumed them. As they reached the edge of town, Sarah glanced at Tom, her heart full of gratitude and love. She had never felt more thankful for him, for his unwavering presence. She had been so close to losing everything, but now a new beginning stretched before them. The nightmare was over, and Sarah knew, with Tom by her side, that they would face whatever came next together. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a like to help support the channel. It really makes a difference. Now, we want to hear from you. What part of the story had the biggest impact on you? Was it a character's decision, a twist, or an emotional moment? Let us know in the comments. And if you have any ideas for new stories, feel free to drop your suggestions below. We're always looking for fresh, exciting stories to bring to life. Your suggestion might be the next one featured on the channel. Thanks for being a part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next story.